The wind screamed through the canyon like a wounded animal, carrying dust and echoes that seemed older than time. In that vast emptiness, a boy trudged along the riverbank. His boots split at the seams, his shirt threadbare, his stomach gnawed by hunger. He was no stranger to emptiness. An orphan learns early that silence can be as cruel as hunger, and loneliness bites sharper than any wolf. He had no name that mattered to anyone. Folks called him the stray or that poor boy. Yet he carried himself with a stubborn tilt of the chin, as if daring the world to spit him out. The river roared beside him, swollen from recent rains, churning and frothing with a wildness that mirrored his own restless spirit. He walked with his head bowed, eyes tracing the mud at his feet, when a sound split through the thunder of water, a scream. High-pitched, desperate, human. His gaze shot up. In the rushing torrent, a small figure thrashed against the current, arms flailing, hair plastered across a face twisted with fear. For a heartbeat, the boy froze. His breath caught between disbelief and recognition. Someone was dying, and the world had thrown the choice into his hands. The river was no place for mercy. Logs rolled like battering rams in its grip. Jagged rocks jutted like teeth eager to tear flesh. But before his mind could tally the risks, his body lunged forward. He tossed his threadbare coat aside and plunged into the icy water. The cold struck him like knives. The current seized him, dragging him under, spinning him as though he were nothing more than driftwood. His lungs screamed for air. His chest burned. His hands clawed against the current until his fingers scraped against cloth. The girl's terrified eyes locked onto his, wide as the moon, and in that instant he swore he saw his younger self reflected in them, helpless, abandoned, pleading not to be forgotten. He tightened his grip, but the river fought him with a savage strength. Waves slapped his face, choking him with spray. His arms ached, muscles straining as he kicked against the pull. For a moment, he thought he would sink with her, both of them claimed by the merciless current. A voice in his head jeered, cruel and mocking. "Boy, if you die today, you'll die the way you lived, unnoticed." But he snarled back in silence, forcing his body upward, teeth gritted, refusing to release the girl. Inch by inch, stroke by stroke, he wrestled their bodies toward the bank. Branches tore at his skin as he neared the shore. The current ripped the girl from his grip once, but he lunged again, fingers locking around her wrist with the desperation of someone who had lost too much already. With a final surge, he hauled her onto the mud, collapsing beside her, coughing river water until his chest felt torn apart. For long moments, neither moved, both sprawled on the earth as the river thundered past, indifferent to the lives it had almost stolen. The girl stirred first. She coughed weakly, water spilling from her lips, then whispered something in a language he didn't understand. Her voice was broken, trembling, but it carried gratitude like a fragile flame. She met his gaze, her dark eyes glassy with shock yet steady with recognition. Though words failed between them, the bond forged in that desperate struggle was undeniable. He tried to rise, but his legs betrayed him, shaking like saplings in the wind. He stayed kneeling, drenched and trembling, staring at the stranger he had pulled from death. She looked younger than him by a year or two, her features marked with the grace of a people he had seen only from afar, always at a distance, often spoken of in whispers. Her presence stirred questions he didn't dare voice, but one truth seared itself into his heart. He had saved her, and that mattered more than any empty name he carried. A sudden crack of wood echoed from the tree-lean. He whipped his head around, senses sharpened by instinct. There, shadows shifting among the trees, tall figures watching. Their silhouettes merged with the foliage, but the gleam of steel tips and the flicker of movement betrayed them. The boy's breath caught. He wasn't alone. The girl's hand reached weakly toward him, her lips shaping a warning he couldn't understand. Before he could speak, the figures melted back into the forest, silent as ghosts, leaving only the memory of their presence. The boy swallowed hard, every instinct screaming that he had been judged, weighed, and left uncertain of his fate. He glanced at the girl, lying exhausted yet alive at his side, and felt the world shift beneath his feet. Night began to creep across the sky, painting the river in bruised colors. He knew he couldn't stay here. Something about those eyes in the trees promised that his act of mercy had not gone unseen, and consequences were already in motion. He pressed his palm against the earth, steadying himself, then looked once more at the girl. She was breathing, her chest rising and falling, fragile yet steady. Relief tugged at his heart. For the first time in years, he felt like more than just a stray. The river still raged behind him, but its roar no longer drowned his thoughts. It felt instead like a herald, as though it had carried him across a threshold he had never known existed. He didn't realize it then, but the boy who had entered the water was not the same boy who had crawled out. Something in him had been claimed, by the river, by the girl, and by the eyes that had watched from the shadows. He pulled himself upright, swaying on tired legs, and whispered hoarsely into the evening air. "You're safe now." The words were meant for her, but perhaps also for himself. He didn't yet know who those watchers were, or what they would demand of him. All he knew was that the world had shifted, and tomorrow would not come quietly. The morning broke with a haze of gold stretching across the horizon, light glinting off the restless surface of the river. The boy woke stiff and sore, his limbs heavy from exhaustion, his clothes stiff with dried mud. For a moment he thought it had all been a dream, the roar of water, the fight for breath, the fragile hand clutched in his own. But then he turned his head and saw her lying close by, wrapped in damp strands of her dark hair, chest rising with steady breaths. Reality struck with the weight of a hammer. He had saved her, and now the world would not let him forget it. He pushed himself upright, scanning the tree-line where the shadows had moved the night before. The forest seemed still, birds darting through branches, the occasional snap of twigs echoing. Yet his skin prickled, as if unseen eyes still measured his worth. He tore his gaze away and crouched by the girl. She stirred, opened her eyes, and for the first time her voice reached him with clarity. The words were halting, patched together in broken English. "You save. River take me. You are not let." The gratitude was raw, fragile, like something carried on trembling shoulders. He swallowed and managed a small nod. Anyone would have tried. The words felt false even as he said them, for he knew most would have turned away. A low rumble trembled through the ground. He frowned, standing as the sound grew louder. Hoofbeats, many of them, rolling like thunder across the plains. He spun toward the open stretch of grassland just as the riders appeared, cresting the hill in a line so vast it seemed the earth itself was giving birth to warriors. 100 horses, 100 spears, dust rising in clouds around them. They rode with precision, a storm of bodies and power, and the boy's heart leapt into his throat. The girl sat up, her lips parting with recognition. Her eyes shone with relief, not fear. She raised a trembling hand toward the riders, and in that gesture the boy understood. They were hers. The ones who had watched from the shadows last night had not been phantoms. They had been scouts waiting. And now the full force of their people had come. The riders closed in, encircling him with practiced ease, their horses stamping and snorting, nostrils flaring. Spears gleamed in the morning light. Arrowheads glistened with menace. At their center, a tall man dismounted, his face marked by lines of age and war, his shoulders broad beneath the weight of authority. He approached with steps heavy as stone, his gaze shifting from the girl to the boy. When he knelt by her, she reached for him, clutching his arm with desperate affection. A father's eyes softened, just for a moment. Then they turned to the boy, and the softness hardened into scrutiny. The boy felt every scar, every hunger-filled night, every insult thrown at him pressing down under that stare. He wanted to speak, to explain, but his mouth was dry, his tongue heavy. Instead, he stood silent, meeting the man's gaze with a stubbornness born of years of survival. Murmurs rippled among the circle of warriors. One spat in the dirt and muttered words the boy could not understand, though their meaning carried well enough in tone. Another scoffed, jerking his chin toward the boy as if he were no more than a stray dog sniffing where it didn't belong. The orphan's chest tightened, heat rising in his face, but he did not flinch. The leader raised a hand, silencing them. His voice rolled out deep and commanding. He spoke first in his own tongue, then in careful English. "You pulled her from the river. You could have let her die. But you did not." The boy nodded, though his heart hammered. The man's eyes narrowed. "Why?" The question hung heavy in the air. Why indeed? He could have walked on, could have left her to the current, could have spared himself this very moment of suspicion and threat. But when he thought of her hand clawing against the current, of her eyes wide with terror, the answer came without hesitation. "Because no one should die alone," he said softly. A silence followed. The warriors' expressions shifted, some skeptical, some thoughtful. One stepped forward sneering. "Stray dogs bark noble words, but still they steal scraps." The boy bristled, fists clenching, the sting of years of mockery flaring in him again. He nearly spat back, but the leader's raised hand stilled the air once more. The girl pushed herself to her knees, her voice breaking as she spoke both in her language and fragments of English. She defended him, telling them how he fought the river, how he refused to let go. Her words wove through the circle like fragile threads binding the boy to her story. Laughter broke out suddenly, light and rough. One of the younger warriors chuckled at the boy's awkward attempt to repeat a phrase she had just taught him. His tongue tripped over the syllables, twisting the meaning into something crude, and the circle erupted with amusement. Even the leader's lips twitched in a reluctant smile. For a fleeting moment, warmth touched the boy's heart. He had never heard laughter directed at him without cruelty in its core. This time it carried something lighter, something almost welcoming. Yet the moment was cut short. A shout rose from the outer edge of the circle, sharp and urgent. A scout galloped in, breathless, words spilling in warning. Though the boy could not grasp their meaning, the tension that seized the warriors told him enough. Eyes sharpened, hands tightened on weapons, horses pawed the ground. Danger approached. The leader barked orders, the warriors shifting into formation with fluid precision. The boy stood frozen at the center, the girl clutching his sleeve. She whispered in broken words, "Others come, not friends." The implication cut through him. Someone out there wanted blood, and it would find them soon. The leader turned to him once more, his voice ironclad. "If you stand, you fight. If you run, you are nothing." The boy's throat tightened. He had fought hunger, cold, and loneliness his entire life, but never had he stood in the path of battle with 100 eyes measuring his worth. He glanced at the girl, her gaze pleading but fierce, and something in his chest shifted. He bent to pick up a weapon left in the dirt, a bow, crude and unfamiliar in his hands. His palms sweated, his heart thundered, yet he lifted it all the same. The circle began to move, warriors breaking outward, forming ranks to face the unseen threat. Dust swirled around them, carried on a wind that reeked of storm and blood. The boy tightened his grip on the bow, every nerve alive with fear and defiance. And then the first arrow hissed from the trees, splitting the air with deadly promise. The arrow struck the earth at his feet, quivering in the dirt like a serpent's tongue. In that instant the world erupted. Horses shrieked, warriors shouted, and the trees vomited forth enemies, faces painted in ash and crimson, their cries piercing the air as they charged. The orphan felt the ground lurch beneath him as if the earth itself recoiled from what was coming. His bow shook in his hands. He had never loosed an arrow in his life, yet now he stood in the center of a storm, surrounded by men born to war. The first clash came like thunder. Spears collided, arrows sang, and the boy found himself dragged forward by the tide of warriors. His heart hammered, a drum too wild to control. He fumbled with the bow, string cutting into his fingers as he tried to draw. The arrow slipped, clattering against the ground, and he cursed under his breath. Around him, men moved with lethal grace, every motion honed by years of battle. He was clumsy, an intruder among wolves, and already he felt death brushing close. A figure burst from the brush, blade raised high. The boy stumbled backward, breath catching, instinct screaming. He lifted the bow not as a weapon but as a shield, wood splintering beneath the strike. Pain seared his arm as the force threw him to the ground. He rolled, dirt biting his skin, eyes wide with terror. The enemy loomed, raising the blade again. The boy's fingers closed around a fallen spear, and before his mind could catch up, he thrust it upward. The tip drove into flesh, the man collapsing with a scream that curdled the boy's blood. For a moment he could only stare, chest heaving, horror flooding him. He had taken a life. But there was no time to reckon with the weight of it. Another enemy rushed, and this time the boy's body moved faster than thought. He ducked, scrambled to his feet, and swung the spear clumsily, grazing his attacker's arm. A warrior at his side finished the job, blade flashing, and shot him a quick nod of approval before plunging back into the fray. The boy gasped, realizing he was no longer just a stray in their eyes. He was fighting. The battle raged with a fury that swallowed all sound but its own. Arrows hissed like angry wasps, steel clanged against steel, men cried out in pain or triumph. The boy moved through it in a daze of instinct and terror. His body bruised, his hands raw. He ducked when told, swung when urged, and though each motion felt alien, he survived. More than once he thought he would fall, when an arrow nicked his shoulder, when a blow grazed his skull, but each time he clung to life with a stubbornness carved by years of struggle. Then he saw her. The girl, pressed against a fallen tree, eyes wide as a man closed in on her with murderous intent. Without thought the boy ran. His lungs burned, his legs screamed, but he sprinted with a desperation he had never known. The attacker raised his weapon, and in that final instant, the orphan hurled himself forward. His body collided with the man's side, knocking him off balance. The two crashed into the mud, grappling, fists and knees striking wild. The boy clawed, bit, kicked, anything to keep the blade away. He felt it slice across his arm, hot blood spilling, but he refused to release his grip. With a roar that tore his throat raw, he wrenched the weapon free and drove it downward. The man went still. Silence swelled inside him, deafening, as the boy knelt over the fallen enemy. His chest heaved, his hands trembled, and he could barely see through the blur of sweat and blood. He turned, meeting the girl's gaze. Her eyes shone with fear, but also with something else, recognition. He had saved her again, and this time it was not just against the river. The fight around them waned. The attackers faltered, retreating into the forest with cries of frustration, leaving their dead scattered like broken dolls. The warriors gave chase only far enough to drive them back, then regrouped, panting and bloodied, around their leader. Smoke hung in the air, mingled with a metallic tang of blood and the bitter stench of sweat. The boy stood among them, battered and trembling, the weight of his actions pressing heavy on his chest. The wounded were carried to the center, groaning, some beyond saving. The boy's eyes lingered on their faces, twisted with pain, and guilt clawed at him. He wondered if this was what his parents had looked like in their last moments, helpless, gasping, reaching for something that never came. He swallowed hard, the memory searing through him. For the first time, he felt the full measure of what survival demanded. It was not just hunger or cold. It was blood. The leader approached him, studying him in silence. The boy's hand still shook, crimson staining his skin. He could not meet the man's gaze, afraid of what he might see there. Yet when the leader spoke, his voice carried no scorn. "You stood. You did not run." The words were heavy, deliberate, like stones placed one by one into the foundation of something unspoken. The boy dared to glance up, and what he saw in the leader's eyes startled him. Respect. The warriors gathered, and the girl stepped forward, her voice breaking through the hush. She spoke his name, not the cruel ones others had thrown at him, not the dismissive labels of the town, but the name he had carried silently, the one his parents had given before the world tore them away. She spoke it with reverence, introducing him to her people not as an outsider, but as a brother. A murmur swept through the circle. Some looked doubtful, others approving, but none turned away. The leader nodded once, then dipped his hand into a bowl of ash and paint, smearing it across the boy's brow. A feather was pressed into his palm, light as breath yet heavy with meaning. "No longer stray," the leader said. "Brother." The word struck deeper than any wound. The boy's chest swelled, his throat ached, and though tears stung his eyes, he did not let them fall. For the first time, he felt the sharp edges of loneliness dull. He was no longer invisible. He belonged. As the warriors tended their dead and the fires crackled to life, a scout burst into the clearing, breath ragged, voice urgent. His words tumbled too fast for the boy to catch, but the reaction was immediate. Warriors stiffening, hands tightening on weapons, eyes darting toward the horizon. The leader's face hardened, shadows deepening across his scarred features. He turned toward the boy, his voice grim. "Soldiers, come." The camp fell silent, the promise of fresh conflict settling over them like a storm cloud. The boy clutched the feather in his hand, heart pounding as the realization struck him. His trial was not over. It had only just begun. The horizon darkened with dust before the sound reached them, a low rumble that rolled like distant thunder. The warriors stood tense, weapons gripped tight, eyes fixed on the line of the earth where the storm grew larger. The boy stood among them, feather clenched in his fist, every nerve raw with anticipation. He remembered the scout's warning: soldiers were coming. What he did not know was whether they brought death or salvation. The weight of that uncertainty pressed against his ribs like a stone. The first riders appeared, silhouettes carved against the setting sun. Rows upon rows, their numbers staggering, their discipline unmistakable. 100 men on horseback, armed and armored, their banners snapping in the wind. The boy swallowed hard, his heart rattling in his chest. He had never seen so many soldiers moving as one. Their presence seemed to tilt the world, like mountains marching toward him. The warriors bristled, shifting into defensive ranks. The leader raised his hand, signaling stillness, though the air thrummed with the promise of violence. The boy felt caught between tides. On one side, the family he had just been welcomed into, battered yet unbroken. On the other, a force so immense it could crush them like ants. For a brief, terrible moment he thought he might watch them collide, might watch the fragile belonging he had found torn apart before it had time to grow. The soldiers drew nearer, the pounding of hooves shaking the ground, until the air was thick with dust and sweat. At last they halted, forming a wall of horseflesh and steel. The boy squinted through the haze, searching for a sign of intent. Then one man rode forward. His armor was worn, his face scarred, his bearing that of someone who had lived too long with blood on his hands. He looked over the gathered warriors, then fixed his gaze on the boy. Silence gripped the clearing. The boy's throat tightened, his fingers digging into the feather until it bent. The man spoke, his voice gravel rough. "So this is the one." He glanced toward the leader, who remained steady, unreadable. The soldier dismounted, dust swirling around his boots as he strode forward. He stopped before the boy, studying him with eyes that cut like knives. "You saved her," the man said, nodding toward the girl who hovered close behind. His words carried neither question nor praise, but certainty. The boy opened his mouth, but no sound came. The man continued, "That choice has bound you, not just to her, to all of them." His hand swept toward the warriors, then toward the line of soldiers still waiting. "And to us." The boy blinked, struggling to understand. The man's expression softened, though only slightly. "These men you see are not enemies. They are brothers to your brothers. We are bound by blood spilled together, by wars fought shoulder to shoulder. And now by you." He turned, addressing both groups at once. This boy stood where many men would falter. He faced the river. He faced the blade. He stood. A murmur rippled through the crowd, both soldiers and warriors alike. The boy's chest tightened. He felt their eyes on him, weighing, measuring. He had spent his life invisible, yet now 100 men saw him clearly, and it was almost unbearable. The leader of the warriors stepped forward, laying a hand on the boy's shoulder. "He is brother," he said simply. His voice carried across the clearing, firm as stone. The soldier beside him nodded. "Then he is brother to us as well." The words struck like a hammer, shattering the shell the boy had carried his whole life. Orphan. Ray. Nobody. Those names fell away, meaningless, replaced by something new. Brother. Family. 100 strong. He felt the ground steady beneath him, as if for the first time his feet had found true earth. Yet acceptance did not come freely. One of the soldiers stepped forward, his voice sharp. "If he is to be counted among us, let him prove it. Let him take the trial." The boy stiffened, fear coiling in his gut. The leader nodded gravely. "So it must be." They led him to the center, where both warriors and soldiers formed a circle. At its heart stood a great horse, black as midnight, wild-eyed and restless. The boy's breath caught. He had seen horses before, broken, bridled, tamed. But this one was no tame creature. It pawed the ground, muscles rippling, nostrils flaring. The task was clear. He must mount it, master it, or be cast aside. The circle waited, silent but watchful. The boy's pulse thundered in his ears. He stepped forward, every instinct screaming to turn back. Yet he thought of the river, the cold that had nearly claimed him. He thought of the blade, the blood on his hands. He thought of the girl, her eyes filled with trust. And he thought of the words spoken by both leaders. Brother. He could not turn away. He approached the horse slowly, speaking low, though his voice trembled. The animal's ears flicked, eyes rolling white. It reared suddenly, hooves lashing, and the boy dove aside, the circle erupting with shouts. Pain lanced through his shoulder as he hit the ground, but he scrambled up, grit stinging his palms. He faced the horse again, heart hammering, refusing to yield. Minutes stretched like hours as he circled, coaxed, lunged, and fought. The horse resisted with fury, but the boy clung on, every ounce of strength wrung from his battered frame. Dust coated his skin, blood streaked his arms, yet still he held fast. At last, with a final desperate heave, he swung himself onto its back. The beast bucked, twisted, screamed, but he locked his legs tight, hands buried in its mane, refusing to fall. Slowly, impossibly, the horse relented, its fight draining until it stood trembling beneath him. The circle roared with approval. Warriors raised spears, soldiers slammed fists to their chests, the sound like thunder rolling across the plains. The boy sat astride the horse, chest heaving, eyes wide with disbelief. He had done it. He had proved himself. The leader lifted his hand, silencing the crowd. "He came to us astray," he said, voice carrying through the dusk. "He stands among us a brother." The soldier echoed the words, and for the first time both groups raised their voices as one. 100 men, warriors and soldiers, claimed him in unison. The boy slid from the horse, his legs unsteady, his body aching. Yet inside, something stronger than pain burned, a fierce, unshakable belonging. He turned, meeting the girl's gaze, and saw her smile through tears. For the first time, he allowed himself to smile back. Night fell, campfires sparking to life, laughter and voices rising beneath the stars. The boy sat among them, warmth on his face, food in his hand. The ache of loneliness eased at last. The feather still rested in his palm, now joined by the memory of firelight and voices that called him brother. And though he said nothing, he knew a truth he would carry forever. Family was not blood. Family was the river that nearly killed him, the battles that scarred him, the people who saw him stand and chose to call him theirs. He had not been born into it. He had fought for it. So when the narrator's voice reached into the quiet, it came not as a whisper, but as a call to those listening. The boy who had no name found one, not in blood but in loyalty. Family isn't always given. It is earned, fought for, bled for, saved from rivers. If this story stirred something in you, don't let it vanish like smoke. Share it, speak it, remember it. And if it moved you, don't